What is it that we're trying to accomplish when we present this?
Mainly, it's our introduction into why it's important to know not just how to speak Spanish, but also some background and some cultural issues, because the language isn't going to be enough all the time. So that's why we go through all the different terms and explain exactly, to our best ability, what those terms really mean, what connotations they might carry with them, and how knowing all of this can help you avoid issues, so that then the language in your interviews runs smoothly.
I'm sure you remember Jose Alentado telling us ability with a language without having kind of an equal share of cultural understanding would often lead to more problems than it helped. What would it matter to know where somebody's from? Why don't we just hit that first? How would you explain why it's important to know if somebody is originally from Cuba, or if they're from South Florida, or if they're from Mexico, or maybe they were from Mexican parents, but they were raised and educated in the United States?
I always kind of equate this on a certain level to all the countries that speak English, right? Okay. And how obviously there's differences in the language. So that's one thing. There's terms that English speakers use in Britain that we don't use here, or if we do use them, they don't mean the same thing.
Sure.
Again, the same with Australia and Canada. So there's not only that, but there's also regionalisms within the United States. So that's on its base level, that's part of it. Now, the other thing that is important, that unlike our Anglo culture, where, if you assume I'm from Canada and I'm not, it means really nothing to me. I just say, oh no, I'm from the U.S. I'm not Canadian, or vice versa.
Right.
But just because all these countries share the Spanish language doesn't mean that they all get along, right? Like we get along with Canada, we get along with Australia. So there are certain long-standing rubs between some countries.
Certainly,
and like Guatemala and Mexico,
for sure,
which we point to all the time. So and there's problems between Chile and Bolivia. Okay, mm-hmm. and the only way to know those things is to know historically what events led to this adversarial connotation. Hey, don't confuse me as this, or don't confuse me as that. Again, it goes to us accomplishing our objective, which is an interview. Whether it's an adversarial interview or whether it's just somebody that's a witness, we want to make sure that we get the information. And if we automatically assume they're from a certain place, and we say that, and they get upset,
but it can have kind of an undercurrent.
That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah. So we wouldn't know that our interview is influenced by that, because it is an undercurrent.
In my career, I remember I didn't use Spanish interpreters, but I was brought in at times when other people were using them. For example, if you've got somebody who's got a Puerto Rican background interviewing somebody who's from Mexico, a lot of times the interpreter and the person they're trying to interpret for can have some negative chemistry. Upbringing and the way you were raised and how you perceive people is pretty deep-seated stuff, and it can really be a distraction to getting the facts straight and getting information and cooperation in an interview. Right.
Exactly. And again, that's our purpose with this thing. And why would you want to mess up your interview when, by knowing some of these things, you can avoid any of that and exactly get what you want out of the interaction?
Absolutely. So what advice can you give someone who's going to have to use an interpreter in an interview? Say we got a law enforcement officer that's trying to interview a witness, and we know that perhaps this witness hypothetically is from some part of Mexico. And then we ask for an interpreter, and the interpreter that we draw for this particular interview ends up being Puerto Rican. Sometimes those two demographics are going to have some hard feelings, right? What advice would you give to manage that? If this is the only interpreter you got available, what are you going to do?
Before the interview even takes place, a conversation has to occur with the interpreter. Based upon my knowledge, and probably his knowledge too, or her knowledge too, there could be some underlying issues here which we need to get beyond. Mm-hmm. And the first thing that you do in any interview is just breaking the ice, establishing a relationship with that person before you get into the meat of what you want. The simple question, hey, where are you from? And most of us have traveled to some of these countries, and and to even relate, oh yes, I was in that country, and so enjoyed this or the other thing. Anything, the normal stuff you would do in an interview.
So rapport building.
Exactly.
But if a guy's coming into this and he's got a limited amount of Spanish vocabulary to draw on, can you give me an example of maybe somebody like that having to do that? Maybe we're waiting for that interpreter to arrive, or trying to lay groundwork before the process, or even if the interpreter's already in the room and we're getting ready to make introductions. How might one use that little bit of knowledge of Spanish to get that rapport started?
Expressions of courtesy using señor and señorita and señora, and of course that we go into a little bit of differentiation on that as far as when to use señora and señorita, beyond just the obvious he's married or unmarried. So these terms of respect and understanding when to use some of these terms is obviously going to be important, because it shows that you at least understand a little bit about this beyond just the language. You understand a little bit about the culture. Maintaining eye contact with who you're talking to, especially when the interpreter is in the room.
Because we don't want the connection to form between the interviewee and the interpreter, because we don't always know how that's going to go, right?
Well, first of all, it deflects any problem. Like you mentioned, you had an interpreter maybe from the PR and then somebody from Mexico, right? So it deflects that issue a little bit. It shows an amount of respect. So if I'm talking to you and the interpreter's over here, when I have a question for you, I go like this. There's a disconnection that takes place because I'm saying, hey, ask this person this. And then I look back at the person I'm interviewing. So a disconnect takes place beyond just watching for a reaction from interviews like we normally do. Maintaining eye contact, keeps a level of respect there. It kind of marginalizes the interpreter as opposed to marginalizing the person that you're interviewing when you're looking over here at the interpreter, if that makes sense.
It does. And it also brings to mind the fact that if you're working with a professional interpreter, somebody who does that for a living or who has a background in actual best practices for interpreting, they're going to want to kind of be out of the picture. They might even try and place themselves out of the line of sight of the person that you're talking to. If you're working with maybe a bilingual person, maybe another officer in a law enforcement setting, they may not know those best practices. You may need to kind of ask them, hey, just interpret what I'm saying. I'll keep things short and simple. I'm going to have you sit over here kind of off to the right behind them out of their line of sight. That's something that seems to be pretty effective as well. Yeah,
and especially important with another officer, Adam, because he may think that he's doing the interview and then you become that marginalized person.
Yep.
Right? Like, what do you want me to ask this guy or this gal? And those conversations between you and the interpreter, especially if they're an officer, take place before you ever go into that interview scenario. So that, hey, keep in mind A, B, C, D. We're on the same page, and when you go in there, things will go much smoother.